Welcome to the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, a series of educational podcasts that showcase the connection between human capabilities and good work design, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia. Hi everyone and welcome to the HFE Hub. I'm Sharon Todd and today I'm chatting with Ken Catchpole, who is a Professor of Human Factors at Medical University of South Carolina. Now, Ken Catchpole is well known in the health industry, and he is a cognitive scientist and human factors practitioner who seeks to understand and improve human performance in complex systems. After working at the University of Oxford for nearly 6 years, he was invited to join the Cedars-Sinai Medical Centre in Los Angeles to embark on new projects in trauma, handovers, teamwork, and systems redesign. He subsequently moved to the Medical University of South Carolina, where he leads major grants in medication, safety, surgical technology, instrument reprocessing, retained foreign objects, and a large number of smaller projects. Well, Ken, it's so great to have you on the HFE podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, the whole way from South Carolina, I think. Am I right?
That's right. Yes, I'm currently in South Carolina. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm really excited about the conference. And yeah, because I love what I do and I get all excited about being able to talk to people about it.
Yes, so the HFESA conference, for anybody who doesn't know, is between the 1st and the 3rd of December 2025 this year in Tasmania in Launceston. And if you go to the hfesa.au website, you can find out more details on the front page. So, Ken, it'd be great for you to tell us a little bit about yourself, how you became interested in human factors and what your current role is.
Yeah, so I'm originally from the UK. I studied ergonomics at Loughborough as an undergraduate course, actually after some career guidance, where I said, yeah, I kind of like science, but I also kind of like touchy-feely psychology and design stuff. And somebody said, oh, well, why don't you try ergonomics? And it was, one of the best decisions I ever had. I love human factors and ergonomics and have been, doing it since first starting my studies in 1991. I enjoyed it so much. I did a PhD in Leeds, and then worked for UK Defence for a little while, and then became involved in healthcare. At which point, around 15 years ago, I got an opportunity to move to the US. So I moved to Los Angeles in 2011 and then got another opportunity to move to South Carolina about 5 years later, so in 2016. So yeah, and it's I'm so lucky to be able to do the things that I do. I've had some amazing experiences and done all sorts of things both in healthcare and outside of healthcare that other people don't get to do. And so I feel really lucky that I've been able to have the experiences I have and have the career that I have.
So tell us a little bit about some of those experiences and what you're doing at the moment.
Yeah, my PhD, I sat in the back of an ambulance looking at driver reactions to ambulance sirens, which itself was great. We were literally driving around Leeds on the way to emergencies, taking videos, out of the front windscreen. So that was a whole experience. When I worked for defence research. Got involved in civil aviation work. So, at one point we were working on situational awareness, and I was working with British Airways and got to fly one of their big simulators. I was also doing work on detection of knives, guns, and bombs at airports, which is fascinating. And was actually the work we were doing had a really profound effect on the detection of those threats in the UK, and this was all kind of pre 9/11. And then I became involved in healthcare because I was looking for a new opportunity and was kind of dropped into congenital heart surgery, which is some of the most complex, high-risk surgery that you can do. This is really radical or drastic what's the word? Radical, drastic, high-risk surgery on 10-day-old babies who these amazing people get together and do these amazing life-saving surgeries. And after that was kind of, hooked with the idea of being able to help these teams do these incredible jobs by thinking about and applying human factors principles. And so since then, I've spent, the last 22 years actually in and around hospitals and healthcare, working with amazing people, doing all these, amazing things, and really being able to help them see their work in a different way, help them to understand why things go wrong and how to stop things going wrong, and actually helping them to I think, in a way, understand their own expertise in a way that they might not necessarily have appreciated before. So yeah, those are I could go on, but I'll stop there.
No, that's okay, because you've brought up some really interesting things. Obviously, why things go wrong. So maybe let's talk in that space for a moment. And I'm not sure if that's where in the congenital heart surgery you were looking at where things go wrong, but maybe I should ask that question.
Yes, that was my job. I was literally dropped into, without any healthcare experience or any sort of understanding of healthcare systems, I was dropped into these incredibly complex surgeries and said, right, go and find some errors. And, and I hope at the conference to tell a little bit of that story, because I think, that's kind of been a profound personal experience for me, but also, has helped me to understand the people and the work that they do, by actually immersing myself in understanding the clinical complexity of this work, and in doing that, realizing in a way how little, or how much systems thinking could play, and how much human factors engineering could play and can play, in helping these amazing people do that work, in an effective and safe way, and in moving beyond blame to understand why things go wrong. And this has been, essentially the rest of my, most of my life's work in doing that. And yes, so yes, it is literally, yes, I have stood for hundreds of hours in operating rooms looking at what goes wrong, and you need, you need to stand in an operating room about 6 minutes before something goes wrong. It's not serious, but it's there's always something, and you can always learn from that, and it tells you something about the underlying system and how it might work for people in certain ways and how it doesn't work for them in others. And so, through that, have developed, these ways to understand and improve, not only kind of, safety and reduce accidental harm, but also improve the everyday systems of work in which people, in which these amazing people work.
Can you give us a practical example of where you discovered something going wrong at any point in time in any of the projects that you've worked on? And this won't be hard. And basically what you did and what the outcome was.
Yeah, so what I sort of love is that I get involved when there have been persistent problems. So my current project, for example, is on retained foreign objects, sewing up people with things still inside them, which is a recurrent problem. And, and with a kind of human factors lens, you're able to give new ways to think about problems in a way that actually most healthcare organizations and the healthcare, practitioners and lecturers in the healthcare industry really hasn't recognized. And there are lots of examples of that. I've also had a long-term interest in robotic surgery in the same way, and in sterile processing, the cleaning of surgical instruments, all of which are, critical to safety and can go wrong. The project that I'm best known for, which was an early project, but, wonderfully, a wonderful example of this idea, and also, really helped to engage a wider audience, was in looking at the transfer of these very sick babies from surgery to intensive care. which is this complex, time-pressured process involving, lots of people and transfer of equipment and transfer of information. And I was working with some doctors who were into Formula One at the time. And so they said, well, actually, this is like a pit stop. So let's learn. So we went and learned about pit stops from Ferrari and then translated that expertise, into the transfer of these babies, which was, in a way, it was a kind of a small demonstration project, but also in a way was great because it was a great way to engage people, engage clinicians who haven't really necessarily always thought about systems engineering the way that we do. But it was a great way to engage them in that sort of thinking, and that, and also that. That's been kind of spread and used all across the world, because it's both, a good and practical idea, the things we came up with, and of course it's, it's helping people to see how their work relates to these other kind of amazing, other sets of amazing people can help inspire. So I have made, those are some of the stories, and I won't bore you all day with all the other things that I could talk about.
Oh, not boring me at all. In fact, I'm glad you said that the connection, the understanding between Ferrari was the pit stop. I was thinking the speed, actually, until you went there. I'm thinking, wow, we've moved them quickly from surgery into the ICU, wherever they're going. Well, which is important anyway. So,
absolutely, yes.
I wouldn't mind asking, I guess, what some of the learnings were. Like, what did you translate from pit stop in Ferrari to surgical environments?
Yeah. So what the thing to understand is that clinicians are great at doing clinical things. They're great at the human body, and their surgeons are amazing at using their hands, and knowing the procedures, and cutting and stitching and all the things they do there. Anesthesiologists are amazing at sort of making people nearly dead and then bringing them alive again. And then OR staff, the theatre staff, are great to support that. They know all the equipment and they know all the procedures, and they're some of their jobs are to, for example, make sure that they keep track of all the instruments and that they keep sterile protocol, and that they kind of, but none of them are, but they don't really think about systems engineering in the way that we do. So when you talk about how the design of a surgical instrument or a display, an anesthesia display or a surgical robot, or indeed the layout of a operating theatre can affect performance, this is kind of new to them. That they don't. It's one of those things that if you're not looking for it can be invisible. So what we are able to do, and the kind of generic thing that I've that we apply, but was applied in the Ferrari case, was that you can take these systems engineering principles and understand the work, using these, using human factors techniques in a way that clinicians have never thought about it before. And then in doing so, in kind of decomposing it, and starting to understand how all the pieces, the pieces and how they fit together, you can then start putting in protocols and supports and ways of doing things that take advantage of the expertise of the people in the system, but also provide them with support. So a good example is checklists. We use checklists, and in fact not a little bit more sophisticated than just a checklist. We also did things like recognize that if you're doing too many things at once, that things are going to go wrong. And so we deliberately, organize this process. So all the equipment pieces would be done first, and then we had certain checks that we built in around the transfer of the equipment so that you get the baby stable. And then you have a conversation, helped by, structured information transfer, memoirs, checklists, that kind of thing. That you can then have a conversation about what those babies' needs are. But you do the technology piece, and then you do the information transfer piece. There's also on top of that things like teamwork and leadership, how, how in a pit stop, everyone has a role and they know what that is and they're assigned to that. Those things that nobody had thought about those when we came to do this in healthcare. And it's kind of obvious that you need somebody whose job it is to plug in the infusion pumps. Because if they don't plug in the infusion pumps after an hour, the infusion pumps run out of battery and the patient, starts to decompensate and nobody knows why. Well, okay, it's very simple to kind of engineer that. It's somebody's responsibility, and there's a role who's, part of their role is to make sure the infusion pumps are plugged in. But up till then, nobody had really thought about it in that way. So none of it was particularly complex, but actually, but it was both, these activities of understanding how pit stops worked, and then, and then understanding how we could translate the strengths, how pit stops have been designed, to deal with, to support teams and to create, reliable performance, through leadership function, task analysis, role allocation, all those sorts of things, and translate that into this healthcare context where they'd never really thought about this before. And so it was, that worked really well. And in a way, all my subsequent work has been, related. It's got more sophisticated. We do more complex things. We use different, tools and techniques. But, it does come down to a similar process of understanding what the real work is like, and then, applying what we know from systems engineering and human factors principles, to support the people doing the work in these ways that, often they've never thought about before because they're not trained to do that.
No, and then that extends to the ward where the paediatric bubba is being moved as well, because they need to know that you're coming for starters, and then right. They need to be prepared so that their roles are also covered. So did you address the relationship between the two units?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the issues was that it wasn't, it wasn't always clear that the intensive care, receiving intensive care unit didn't always know when the patient was going to arrive, and they didn't know, the status in which, the state of the patient when they were going to arrive. And so, that was actually a very specific part of it. We sent down information to allow the bed space to be set up and configured to receive that baby before they'd left the operating room. And so this time when you're transporting them on this, on mobile monitoring, it can, that's a really, really high risk part of this process, because you're going from, safe, stable, well-resourced, monitoring and intervention, potential within the operating room. You've also got that in the ICU, but there's this space, in between down hospital corridors, that, by the way, other people are coming and going in, and you've got to go through doors. So so you want to minimize that kind of risk. And so that was another piece of that, of helping the team prepare, because of course we know that if you're able to prepare, if you're able to brief, if you know what's coming in, if it's not a surprise, then you're going to be much more mentally prepared. You're going to be able to respond in a different way. You'll already visualize the work that you need to do, which we know improves performance. Exactly. All of those things, went into this new process.
Did you do anything about the redesign of how they attach some of the things to the beds? Because, they come down the corridor there, it's pretty crazy. It looks like a crazy grocery shop with stuff hanging out the sides. Did you look at any of that aspect of it as well? Because things can get bumped as they move.
Yeah, we did a little of that. We had to make sure, this was a long time ago, but yes, one of the things we did is we made sure that before transferring the patient out of the OR, that one of the infusion pump, I think it's called a tree. There's basically it's a pole,
stand, IV stand, yeah.
That's right. It's like an IV stand. Yeah, it's not a Mayo stand, but yes, exactly. It's and so that was the idea, to have one of those, so you weren't having to put the infusion pumps in the bed. We also tried to pay attention to things like the lines, these infusion pumps, these long lines, going to the patient, and they all get tangled up. So we tried to work a little bit on, and some of what we did was help to reduce the amount of tangling of those, and thinking about labeling of those. There was also a piece around the monitoring, that you have these transducers that need to be appropriately zeroed and calibrated when you plug them into the ICU. And if you don't, they're going to read wrong. Again, that was all part of this. Part of thinking through, and because once you lay it out, of course, there's a lot. There's a lot to think about, but actually that's where you can support the people in the work. It's obviously, you make it, once you made it visible, then it makes the learning easier, so people can pick up on all the little pieces of this that need to be done well.
So you've come a long way since then and worked on lots of projects, and at the moment you're working on foreign bodies, and obviously we've got a conference coming up, and I don't want to steal your thunder, but are you able to give us a little bit of an idea of what you're working on at the moment and what you might be talking about at the conference?
Yeah, so there are sort of, I think, three themes really. One of which is my experience through this and how that's shaped my thinking. Because I came into healthcare at a time when there wasn't much human factors going on, and so how I've come to learn about the health system and how we can apply human factors in that, and that, so if you like, some of the stories about what that's been like, because I hope that there's an interest in that from, particularly for new or mid-career human factors professionals who are sometimes faced with many of the challenges that I had, and so. Anyway, so that's that. So the second piece is around the flavour for some of the projects I've been involved in, and what that tells us about healthcare, and what that tells us about how human factors engineering can really help healthcare. And by the way, and then the third piece that brings those two ideas together is around thinking about the challenges and facilitators, if you like, for the spread of human factors expertise in healthcare, because there's so much more to do, and it's not always easy. It hasn't been always easy sort of doing this sort of work. And so over the past 20 years, seeing how that's changed, and seeing how human factors and initially nobody had any idea what it was in healthcare, and how it's been become to be adopted, how it's creating what I think is a sort of new professional model for human factors professionals working in these people who are going out into hospitals to do human factors work, embedded within the human factors often as the kind of sole human factors practitioner in a hospital. It's an incredible way to do this sort of work, and it's essential to do this work well, but it also comes with professional and personal challenges, and often a lot of resistance from healthcare organizations who, for this is a new way of thinking. So it's kind of a combination of those three things, around some of my experiences and some of these stories around some of the technical pieces. I'm fascinated by what we call diagnostic error, but actually probably isn't error. I'm fascinated by getting under the skin of clinical work and what that tells us, and how we can apply human factors techniques. And it's also been a key way of thinking for me to encourage and support the people going in to do this work, and to spread the message of what human factors can do to to healthcare systems, in the UK and the US, and I get to do that in Australia too. So, but I'm going to do my best to cover those three general areas.
So you mentioned challenges, and the one big one that always comes up, and you may not have a solution to this, of course, but is money. And I just wondered whether there's ever been any discussions about how might be able to kick through some of that sometimes.
So that's a current challenge for me right now in in the US. I think that there are a number of different approaches. There are a number of different ways to think about this. I think that it's ultimately less about money. Money is a piece of it, but the kind of spread and adoption of human factors expertise within the healthcare system, I think is more about the resistance to the ideas and the implications that human factors has, what it means for the healthcare industry. And by that, I really mean that once you accept that healthcare is not delivered by heroic and not only delivered by heroic and highly trained individuals, but actually there's a system that's behind it, then it forces people to kind of change the way they think about how healthcare is delivered. And this is uncomfortable for people who have existed in the world where it's all about how hard they try and how hard they train. And it is that, but it's not only that. And so actually, I think that, and while there are financial, challenges, and there are some great examples of both, if you like, return on investment, but also and the importance of this, and the evidence base that we have for this, and the value that we have for this, and of people who have been very successful in delivering human factors engineering, both in device design and in this embedded clinical practice that I do. They're all great examples of that, and there are also these other barriers that we are overcoming, and that we but we will overcome, and that's something I'm also very interested in, because I'm ultimately fascinated about how people view the world and how human factors provides this really different way for people to see the world, and that we as human factors professionals kind of assume everyone sees, and they don't, and it's really wonderful and sometimes challenging to get those messages across. So yeah, that's a good question.
And actually, you went somewhere where I probably should have asked a question a bit earlier. Over the years, how have you found the best way to sell the benefits of human factors?
So I'm not a very good salesman. I think that, and so I can tell you lots of ways not to do it. I think it's definitely multifaceted. Unlike other industries, healthcare really values evidence base, really values science and academic rigor, and there are actually very important reasons for that in terms of how we manage resources and how we understand what's effective or not. And that's the first thing, and in a way that's a big part of where my career has led to prevent people accidentally dying in hospital, or reduce the number of people accidentally dying harmed in hospital, which has been my life's mission since coming into healthcare. I recognize that an important thing there was the evidence base. So the evidence base helps, and indeed there's and so, for example, I remember the first time I had a paper published in Annals of Surgery. I was working in the in Department of Surgery in Oxford, and all these surgeons who thought I was doing this weird kind of this weird thing. Suddenly they were like, "Oh, you got published in Annals of Surgery. What you're doing is legitimate." And so it kind of changed their attitude. So that was, that's one piece, and there's a lot of that. Another piece is, I think it's about helping people see there is a different way to see the world. And that, in a way, it's got to be drip-fed. You can't say, hey, look, there's this new way to think, and I'm going to tell you how to think, and you're suddenly going to see it in the... So it's also about working over long periods of time with people who are kind of curious, and finding the people who are curious, and maybe maybe they're champions, maybe they don't. Maybe they've heard this thing called human factors, and they've seen, whatever shows about aviation, and they're really interested in it. And then it's like, okay, now I've got a champion. Now I've got somebody to work with. Clinician champions have been, amazing at doing this. And then you can start to help shape their own perceptions of human factors, and kind of drip feed these ideas over time that then changes their whole world, and then buys them into it, and then you kind of have this snowball effect. The other piece of this, ultimately, it was around regulation and how you engage regulators in understanding the value of human factors. One of the biggest changes, or one of the, if you like, the biggest employers of human factors engineers within the healthcare industry are those people who work on the design of devices for FDA approval. And so the FDA taking on human factors regulation has been an important part of that. Another level, it's also about, it's also about the fact that because healthcare thinks in a certain way, they get stuck on certain problems. And so being able to come to a problem and say, for example, retain foreign objects, and say, hey, here's another way to think about it. My temptation is to say, you're thinking about it all wrong. You should think about it in that way. But that's not the way to do it. It's the way to say, hey, think about it in this new way. So that's another piece, and that's being a big piece of what I do. And I've always loved human factors with the focus on individuals. And the fact that, one of our principles is, we have amazing people at the center of our system, and we should be supporting them. And so another thing that has worked really well is when I've been uncovering, it's uncovering the amazing people doing this amazing work. So, within, for example, sterile processing, how you have people who are often, very poorly paid on minimum wage, often just seen as they just wash the dishes. It's just like washing the dishes at Scepter's Instruments. And no, these people are actually, really dedicated to what they do, often really, really experienced. And so being able to go and hang out with those people and understand what they do and appreciate the amazing work that they do, and then, if you like, filter that up to help organizations recognize the things that are going wrong isn't bad people. It's that they've got these amazing people that they need to look after, and they need to be designing the system around the people. And that's that kind of bottom up piece, that doing that, you get, you obtain trust, people recognize your value, and so it's not so much as a selling as actually just working with people. And in a way, I think that's been the most, over time, as I published more and got involved in more things, I've had the opportunity to work with more and more people and kind of drip feed these ideas and work with them and learn from them. And so it's less as a selling job and more like, hey, we get to collaborate and fix these, or think about these problems, and me as a human factors practitioner gets to bring in new ideas into these areas and into these collaborations that these people have never, that people have never been exposed to before.
Thanks for joining us at the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia, where human-centred design really matters. If you like this podcast, make us your favourite in your podcast app. We look forward to chatting with you next time.